listening to Sasquatch Syndicate.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard.
And all the ape believers don't want any of the paranormal believers to say anything because they're all whacked and screwed up and we don't want them. And all the paranormal believers don't want to go to the ape believers saying, well, you're all closed-minded. You're not open to the fact that it does this and it does that.
And I look over my left shoulder and this creature is running through the woods and it's bulldozing the brush down. And I knew, man, this thing is going to get me.
Welcome to Sasquatch Syndicate. I'm your host, Chuck, out in Seattle, Washington, along with Paul in Portland, Oregon. Thanks to everyone for listening and those following us at SasquatchSyndicate.com and on our social media outlets. For those participating in the Sasquatch Syndicate monthly t-shirt giveaway, this month's winner was Jesse Robertson from Short Pump, Virginia. So Jesse, thanks for listening to the show, and please check your Facebook for winner notification. So just a few announcements before we start this month's podcast. I know many of you on the East Coast have been asking for some time when we're going to be making the trip. And just as a reminder, Sasquatch Syndicate will be appearing at AlienCon Baltimore. That's November 9th through 11th at the Baltimore Convention Center. You can get your tickets at thealiencon.com. Sasquatch Syndicate will have an amazing display and booth at this event. We will be at the AlienCon Marketplace in location 406. So if you arrive at AlienCon, please look at your maps and make your way over. We're excited to meet you, and we have a special guest appearing with us as well. And I know as many of you are aware that watch history specials of any kind, in the world of Sasquatch and Bigfoot, nobody has really done more for research and adding credibility to the subject than Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University. And Dr. Meldrum will be appearing with Sasquatch Syndicate, so you don't want to miss this. It's going to be an amazing event. We're going to have field guides, casts, books, all the latest in the field of research. So again, make your way over. We're looking forward to talking Sasquatch. We'll be there all weekend, and you should too. So again, you can get your tickets at thealiencon.com, and we really look forward to meeting you. So on to this month's podcast. With us tonight on Sasquatch Syndicate, we're joined by Jim Perry. He's the host of the podcast Euphomet, and Jim's going to share a little bit about his experiences growing up here in the Pacific Northwest, the world of Sasquatch, and his theories on the subject. But Jim, before we get into that, maybe you can share a little bit about your background and really how you got into the phenomenon.
You know, you guys are going to really resonate with what drew me into this world of examining the unknown and sort of going into the deep, dark woods, per se, you know, both metaphorically and very physically. Growing up and, you know, essentially living and being raised in the Northwest, deep in mountainous territory, with lush forests, you know, being exposed to something like Sasquatch, the idea, the existence of Sasquatch early on, really changes the mind of a curious boy, I think. You know, when my family would go on drives to go see relatives, and we were going over the mountain passes, and we'd be going through the Cascade Mountains, I would always have my eyes pointed out the window into the tree line, hoping, wishing that I could see something, some sign of Sasquatch and have some sort of connection. And, you know, I think out of sort of the anomalous topics that, you know, I work on, that are a part of my life, you know, Sasquatch has a very deep connection. But if there is one thing out there that I really hope is true, is Sasquatch, is the existence of Sasquatch right now, at this moment, having some connection. And I feel I've been close, maybe. but it's interesting. I wouldn't say that I'm a part of sort of the Sasquatch community in a way, but I do feel I'm on the periphery, and that I'm very intrigued and interested by all the sort of great work that's being done by individuals in trying to find some sort of evidence, some sort of physical evidence out there that we're joined by this creature. But I think when I was a kid, there were certain things that opened my eyes or my mind up to anomalous experiences and things being not as they seemed. I tell a story sometimes about my mom, when I was a kid, walking over to the phone and picking it up and having a conversation with my grandmother. And with the phone never ringing. And the same with my grandmother, her getting up, going to the phone, picking it up, having a conversation with my mom. These two had such a connection that it was so commonplace that it was no big deal. It was such a non-issue that I had forgot about it until about a month ago when somebody had asked me this question. And I kept thinking, there were experiences when I was a kid that had probably motivated me in this direction and piqued my interest, so that when things like Art Bell, when I started listening to that show in '95 or whatever, when I started watching those reruns of In Search of, I was predisposed to the mystery of all this stuff. And so, I think that played a really big role in my development.
So, Jim, just kind of looking back on that journey, of entering into the paranormal on your podcast, kind of, growing up with the history you had here in the Pacific Northwest as it relates to this creature, hearing shows like us and others talking about the phenomenon, and then, of course, your own personal experiences, and we're going to get into some of your family history, but where are you at with the phenomenon of Sasquatch today? What do you believe?
So I don't know what I believe anymore. I've had enough anecdotal experience in my time working on this project that so many sort of wild, unknown experiences have happened to me. And I've heard so many stories and shared so much space with this stuff that I don't know what I believe, and I think I'm okay with that.
Now, when you said that you're not sure what to believe in, what has happened to you that has skewed your anchor on what you can and or what you do when you don't believe in? Usually when we talk to individuals about Sasquatch, when we're doing an interview as it relates to a sighting, it always seems, and Chuck, I know you can back me up on this, it always seems like there's a little something extra. In other words, Chuck and I came into this, or at least certainly me, with flesh and blood, and think it's a flesh and blood, it's an ape, it's just something that's out there like a bear. However, the more encounters that we listened to, you could tell there was something that this person wasn't saying in the background, and if we stuck on that enough, we would hear things like it disappeared into a cloud of mist. It just appeared out of thin air. It disappeared into thin air, similar to what you would see in the movie Predator, how it would have that shimmering appearance. Can you tell us, why is it that you're not sure what to believe in?
I mean, I think it would, we are in a situation where we live in a culture, in a society, where there are pretty clear mandates on what is normal and then what is not. And I think as a communicator and a creative and a storyteller, just logistically, I have to keep my place I got to keep my feet very firm on the ground so that I can communicate to the audience in a way that they'll understand and that won't ostracize them. So that's a logistic part of that. But I think that I've experienced so much and heard so many stories of experiences that, well, sometimes they're contradictory, right? Sometimes it's a situation where you'll have okay, so Sasquatch, for example, you'll have an enthusiast, maybe not quite an investigator, but someone that possibly has a connection to this story or has had their own experiences, that will claim and that will stick to this idea that they're nothing but flesh and bone. Yet they also dematerialize. So, and you ask them, okay, well, is Sasquatch is it a spirit being? Is it a ghost? Is it multidimensional? What what do you and I know they don't know, of course, who knows? But what is your broader opinion on what this could be? Hoping, searching for a shred of some sort of open-mindedness into that.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating, your experience, with kind of that closed-mindedness and lack of openness around this topic. We don't have one that we can study, but, until we do, I think everybody can be right. The tribes say it's physical while it's here on Earth. Okay, so maybe that explains the footprint evidence and the physicality of this being a flesh and blood animal. The paranormal enthusiast can be right. Maybe it's only physical when it crosses a dimension. Maybe it's only physical when it arrives from another planet. So regardless of what theory you're into, I think everybody can be right at this point. But having done this well, I'm sure you've ran into those passions about what this thing is.
I've had folks say, nope, they're not any of those things. They're just flesh and blood. Yet they also can dematerialize. And so the broader notion of what even that means, right? Per belief systems, per just the physicality of what that would entail is intriguing.
Jim, just kind of talk about some of your own experiences out on the trail, investigating these paranormal experiences, and what have you seen or what have you experienced, as you're out doing your own research for your show and otherwise?
In relationship to my own experiences, I've been up into the deep woods of British Columbia with a really sweet guy named Brian Bland. He essentially at some point in his life started to receive maybe something similar to he would call it mind speak, and so he would develop these thought forms. He would develop this. He claimed like a sort of a psychic connection with something. He started hearing these voices calling him from the mountain. Hey, you got to come up here. You got to experience us. We want to connect with you. And so one thing led to another. He engrossed himself with a community. Some of them were indigenous peoples. They showed him, or they described to him, this method of communication that they have using essentially sigils, using messages through leaves and sticks that are created into either very ornate, decorative sort of messages or very rudimentary symbols like runes. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, but what was one of the most fascinating part of this story is the amount of community that's based around this idea of communication with Sasquatch and the Sasquatch families, and sort of an international movement that can be found and tapped into very easily online, with folks sharing these messages left on the ground of sticks and rocks and twigs, and saying, oh, is this individual, and pinpointing different personalities and characters within these Sasquatch families. And so, that for me, now I don't like the term woo-woo. Like I don't think it has a place in any of this, because if I believe anything, it's like that all of this is kind of woo-woo, right? If we're talking real, like I don't think anyone has a place to make judgments on other anomalous, unknown experiences. And and my belief is that maybe that'll never happen. You know what I mean? And it's almost like there's at some point we might have to be okay with that. because there's so many similarities between something like Sasquatch and other apparent cryptids, other pieces of lore, other, sort of even mystical stories. If you go through some of the Eastern traditions or even some of the esoteric traditions, saying some of the stories about angels and demons from the mystery schools, there's so much similarity between all of this phenomenon. Even the most standard sort of stories that are out there of ghostly apparitions and what some would claim would be a Sasquatch sighting. There's a lot of tonal similarities in what folks are experiencing, and I don't think, like, anecdotally that could be excused from this either. And I think that the more sort of people within the paranormal community, whether they're investigators, I think that there's, of course, a need for folks that are specifically interested and involved in one topic, right? I think there's a big importance about that. But I think for anyone not to be open-minded while in this field of the anomalous is kind of nuts, because there's too much other evidence that I think can help connect dots and help flesh out maybe a broader understanding of what could be. It all goes back to these very, very big questions that I don't know if we'll ever get answers to. But I think there's enough to be gleaned from these other pieces of the story in terms of the nature of reality, in terms of our relationship to the paranormal. And it goes beyond why we believe and why that's even important. It goes down to these stories. It goes down to these campfire stories, right? And the perplexity of juggling with these events that happen in our lives that we can't classify and we can't even qualify as something as being real. And Sasquatch and ghosts and extraterrestrials and angels and demons, they all sort of live in that space to me. Whether there's tangible physicality, whether we're dealing with flesh and blood in some situation, or we're just dealing with things on a different plane, right? So who's to say?
So, Jim, let's just circle back to the science we are yet to understand, right? And you can call it woo, you can call it whatever you'd like it to be, but, on a daily basis, science is discovering new things about the universe, quantum physics, string theory, you name it, it's out there. And, we learn new things every day. There's so much about the known universe we just are yet to understand. But maybe share a little bit about your opinion and kind of, what you hear and what you've experienced in kind of your journey as an investigative journalist, a researcher, and then, of course, having your own show.
I think in a very broad sense, my opinion is that science is always changing, right? There's so much that we don't know of, like you said, and our impression, our even very mainstream popular opinion of what things like reality is seemingly very flexible and always changing. And it's always been that way. When you had, sort of guys like John Dee, as the science advisor for, the Queen back in the Elizabethan age, he was mixing every sort of esoteric occult practice with more fundamental sciences. After, a lot of that, after that pairing of spirit and science was taken away, and we went into sort of the Francis Bacon side of things and the scientific method, and that's been a prevailing sort of method for figuring out these things that we don't understand around us. But the scientific method itself is starting to shed light and take us back into this other place with the use of quantum science, right? And us figuring out, well, there's there's other things here that we're not even seeing. If we're talking about quantum science, and I'm of course not a physicist by any stretch of the imagination, I could barely get out of biology too, but in high school. But I think that if we were to tap into the curious nature of some of the best minds in science today, you'll see or you'll experience some individuals that are a lot like the well-traveled. So the well-traveled will tell you, the more you travel, the less you know about where we live. And I think there's something to be said for that.
Well, right. And I guess, the question is always, who's to say we're even right? I mean, everything we know to this point is based on a species and scientific record that still doesn't even know how gravity works, so who's to say?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate to sort of be on the periphery of, right? Because there's all these fundamental rules that are out there that establish what is known as normal. What's the normal way of walking around that demonstrates something that is in flesh and blood? And there's some of these popular ideas within sort of our shared consciousness that dictate right now what is woo-woo, like to coin a phrase, and what is not. But I think that as we continue progressing forward, that line is fading, I think, gentlemen. I think that line is getting a little wiggly. It's sort of getting a little out of control. And, I think as long as we're prepared as a culture to get out of sort of this what is it, the darkest night of the soul moment that I think we'll experience together, I think we'll be okay. But, there are certainly, I think, some hurdles in terms of our belief systems, and some things we'll have to, perhaps rectify with in those regards.
So, Jim, maybe we can talk a little bit about just kind of the human condition in general. And certainly, it's comforting to understand kind of what we know and live within that. But let's talk about comfortable versus uncomfortable. And, what do you really believe the human condition is? And why do we struggle so much with that?
Well, yeah, I think if things like frequency and energy are real, I think that if we share some sort of bandwidth, perhaps, that there is a comfort level in being closed down and not accepting a lot of ambiguity into your life, right? I think that the more unknown is fear-inducing. People are scared of what they don't understand a lot of times. And I think the human condition is that it sort of transmutes itself in interesting and unique ways, whether that's politically or socially or whatever that may be. Humans are very interesting in that way. Like, we want to protect the life that we have now, and we want to protect those around us. And that's prehistoric stuff, right? That's primordial ooze stuff. And I think that's of course appropriate in a lot of ways. But I think we can't avoid the fact that we don't know anything, and that the unknown is perhaps something we have to embrace at some point. I think as people, I think that not doing that only leads to more division and fear and a restlessness to find something, to put our hands on something that's maybe never, ever attainable. And listen, for, again, like, this isn't me claiming like a sort of Illuminati or a political agenda or anything else. I think that we all know that folks within power structure, folks that are sort of the stakeholders for the economy, for those that maybe have the wealth, they have a lot to protect in terms of keeping business going, right? And I think a part of that, and I don't know, and I wouldn't claim that it is 100% some sort of scheme or some sort of conspiracy, but they have a lot to gain to keep people like pretty stupid and pretty dumb and pretty fearful, you know, because that'll keep things normal, you know, that will keep this like normalcy bias going on and keep people feeding from the hand, right? And that'll be life. Everyone can keep making money in the same ways and not have to make any major shifts culturally or politically or anything else. And I think that speaks to this overall topic of why people are positioned to fear the unknown. I think that is deliberate, you know, sort of culturalization. I think that's a broader social topic, and I think even you guys having a podcast revolving around Sasquatch, me having a podcast revolving around going around and having these unique experiences with individuals that are sort of unknown, and I think that's a step, I think, in chipping away some of that fear of the unknown. I think that's a step in helping people embrace these things that they can't really explain and have fun with it, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's super fun to talk about the stuff that we're not quite sure of. It's super fun to go out into the forest. I mean, it can suck too. It's really cold and can get wet, but needless to say, I think that's kind of some of the root to it, maybe, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you on just the cultural malaise of that type of thinking. I absolutely agree with you.
And that's one thing, you know, Paul and I talk about quite often is, you know, this comfort of living within the status quo and your own belief systems. And, you know, I'm Aquarian, so maybe that's why I'm more open to the unknown, but I'm more comfortable in the unknown than I probably in the known, just simply because I don't think we have a clue as a human species on what's really going on. But, you know, these controls have been, you know, happening for some time. I mean, you know, you could look back to the Council of Nicaea, you know, and, you know, what chapters of the Bible were relevant to help kind of control the masses and kind of help establish that kind of status quo. And, you know, we see evidence of that today. You know, ISIS trying to destroy, you know, the written record and these, you know, statues of history. And quite honestly, if you wiped out in the written record every 140 years, you know, 2 generations, you could rewrite human history. So there are controls, and I always find it fascinating that people are closed-minded and not willing to ask the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I mean, yeah.
So Jim, just your own experiences around Sasquatch and Bigfoot and experiences in the forest and anecdotally, can you share a little bit about those experiences?
Yeah, you know, I think the Sasquatch journey for me in terms of opening it up into my mind space and being intrigued is that my grandfather was a logger up in the mountains of I guess it would be foothills of the Cascade over on the eastern side of the mountains, sort of in the Okanagan area. So he was routinely up in the hills with his logging crew, sometimes running a water truck, sometimes other forms of machinery, and you know, he'd also take his stock car out there. He'd also cut up the hills. He'd be in his stock car. He'd take my grandma out there. They'd cruise around, whatever. These old logging roads that he knew about and not a lot of people had access to. So they're in beautiful country up there. They're you know, steep mountain cliffs. And for anyone who hasn't been to the Northwest and experienced sort of the grandeur of it all, it's epic. It's, you know, you're up there and you get lost in this sort of cinematic sense of life, right? I mean, yeah, I'm sure you guys have experienced that yourself many times. And my grandfather had a story that on one of these days when he was up there with my grandma carving through these hills, they stopped at this edge, overlooking, checking out a sunset, and started to hear some rustling behind them. This was up an embankment. They were down below. this noise that was happening. And to their side, they start seeing rocks come down. My grandpa starts, getting a little antsy because, this is a logged hill, partially logged. Is this, is the land going to come down around them? That's always a concern. So as, the rocks start sort of flying down, they start to become bigger and bigger and bigger until it's large boulders, right? And, gets out, looks up before taking off, and has a face-to-face with something that's about 11 feet tall, partially concealed by the tree line. And that was a story that has been told ever since, within my family lore. Now, my grandfather, the thing about that story is that he was responsible for spinning some yarns. So the veracity of that story that I just told, in terms of how true it is, not sure. Can't vouch for it in that way because he was a real storyteller. But that being said, that's not a story dissimilar from the ones that we hear all the time. The interaction with these creatures, with different objects, to let you know that there's a presence, to let you know that they see you there, that there's some sort of connection. Some folks will take that as a sign of warning, like, get out of here, you're not welcome here. Others take that as a sign of playful nature. So, this man that for Euphomet I went out into the wilderness with, Brian Bland, who is sort of a little bit of a figure now in this spirit communication with Sasquatch community online. He had experiences that were not so dissimilar. He would have these experiences that he would engage with and engage in sort of rock throwing games with an entity. He identifies this entity as being a juvenile Sasquatch, being very playful in nature, and they would develop this game where they were throwing rocks against a tree, and they would see who could ricochet this rock better. And sitting there in the middle of the woods with this guy, hearing his story about connection with these beings, seeing sort of his eyes kind of water up at how big of an impact they've had with him. He shared a story that his mother had recently passed away. And he came down the hill one day, feeling like complete garbage, mourning. He was very close with his mother. He goes out to his car. And right below his car, he sees a sigil. He sees a sign, a glyph, that he associated with one of the Sasquatch that he has interactions with on a weekly, sometimes daily basis up in the woods. And it was down in town, and it was right next to his car, this glyph. And this was at a time where he wasn't sharing a lot of this stuff, and that would have been a little tricky for folks to know what the semblance of that would mean.
So, Jim, did he describe kind of what that glyph looked like and kind of what the symbolism was behind the glyph?
Yeah, the symbol that he believes is a welcome sign from a being that they call Ari. Now, the names, of course, are, sort of, they've been made up to signify in human language whatever these signs are and whoever these, sort of family members are. But Ari, who they had believed, or they believe, is essentially the patriarch of this community in British Columbia, of the Sasquatch family. It was his symbol, and it's an X. That's also it's sort of an A with an X, made from about, what would it be, four sticks, essentially, two longer to form that triangle base of the A with like sort of an X. I believe that was the symbol. I could be wrong. I believe that was the symbol that represents Ari, also welcoming. They believe that any sort of cross X sign that they find is a signal, is like a hello. They, sort of, I know there's contrasting opinions within the community about what an X represents. Like if we are being shared messages from Sasquatch, I've heard, that X is represented, hey, stay out. Like this isn't your land, stayed, on the other side of this X or whatever else. Like this is no-go zone. For them, they discovered it was something else. They discovered it was like, hey, we know you're looking at this, come on in, but respect what we have going on here at the same time. And so when he saw that sign outside of it, like, at the foot of his car, he became so emotional about that, and it touched him in a way that it made me sort of cherish that moment a little bit and really feel good about this notion that whether that was a Sasquatch that did that or not, it didn't matter, because to him that is what happened. And to him, he has this relationship, and it's a positive, nurturing, caring relationship that he's developed. And I think that's really powerful. And I think a lot of people don't have that at all, let alone from a potentially a supernatural being, right? So, yeah, pretty startling and fascinating stuff. And then kind of heartwarming too, which is nice.
So Jim, with both of us here in the Pacific Northwest, I guess, we can kind of feel the captivation of the allure of this topic because we've stepped into the Olympic National Forest. We've stepped into the Tongass rainforest up in Alaska. And I think for a lot of folks, they don't really understand that experience. It's almost something you have to see to believe. And I don't mean that in a Sasquatch sort of way, but it's almost like if you were to walk into the redwoods and see an 800-foot tree and next to it a pygmy deer, it's almost a scene out of Avatar, and it really kind of expands the mind. But can you talk a little bit back to that connection of the allure of nature here in the Northwest and really how awe-inspiring that is and how it can really expand the mind and really help open the mind to what could be out there?
Thankfully for this show, I've had the opportunity to, every episode I travel out for, and I meet with folks face to face, and I'm usually sitting in a car I'm not familiar with a person I just met, driving deep into some forest somewhere, just hoping at the other end of it is something anomalous, But it's granted me the opportunity to visit a lot of different forest ecosystems, and there is nothing as thick and intimidating and obtrusive than the Pacific Northwest. Our wilderness is that of a survivalist complete nightmare in terms of what it takes to even navigate a mile in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, with the amount of undergrowth and brush and just the proximity and denseness of the trees. It's it makes people panic that are from other parts of the country. I drove through some of that with some of my friends from New York, and they're used to a little bit of the northeast wilderness, and they're outside a lot, and so they're not sort of just some city slicker bunch that have never gone camping before. These are folks acquainted with the wilderness. And it genuinely, driving through, some of the Cascade Wilderness, like it genuinely gave them a little bit of anxiety because it was just so oppressive. And, so yeah, there's nothing like it. And when you have those situations where you're miles and miles and miles out, And that's interesting too. We have miles and miles and miles of forest land where it's really hard to get to. And certainly it's not a group of, crazy 12-year-olds out there making some of these things. And that gives you pause for consideration for sure.
So, Jim, just kind of thinking about that captivation of nature and how mesmerizing it is, how has it affected you emotionally and spiritually as you're out on these trips?
Interesting. I mean, I think I've always been hypersensitive to my surroundings. And I think that my surroundings inspire me creatively. And so above anything, as I mentioned, I'm not like sort of a thoroughbred investigator in any of this stuff. I'm a creative. I'm a storyteller. And with that, my surroundings affect that. And the Northwest is such a sort of a tonal inspiration to everything that I do. I'm on the Oregon coast right now. I'm looking through, very a thick marine layer or fog, sort of straddling the tops of, these ancient trees. And everything is green, everything is blue. It's very mysterious. It looks like an episode of Ozark or a David Fincher movie. And there's a reason why shows like that, why books are set here, why there is an ominous nature to this place that we live. And I think for the folks that haven't experienced it themselves, they need to. I recommend folks come up and go to a place like Orcas Island. Take that ferry from Seattle, go out to Orcas or something, and just experience the not just the flavor, but like sort of the resonance of a spot like that, where you feel alone, yet and fairly isolated, yet okay with that, and go when it's rainy, go when it's cold, go when you have to wear a rain slick to go and navigate like sort of the rocky beach area, and just soak that in and try to have it not affect you. And so as a little kid running around, with interest in all the sort of the mysteries of the universe, when you're running around an environment like that, it's an easy backdrop to, sort of visually in your mind's eye think like, oh yeah, like a Sasquatch could be standing on the other side of that tree, or there could be a witch hut, somewhere in there, or this would be the perfect place for a UFO to touch down, or look at that old barn house, like that's where a ghost would live. It's just sort of the perfect paranormal backdrop for the folks that are interested in that. And I think that almost above anything, the environment in the Pacific Northwest has almost infected me in that way. So huge influence, and I don't think I could ever live anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, for sure. It's something to behold and actually cherished. And, I think it's one of the reasons, not only do we love nature, but the Pacific Northwest is just amazing. And so we're really blessed and fortunate enough to live up here and be able to do the things we do and explore and research and all those great things. So, Jim, in terms of topics on your show, have you crossed into beyond the paranormal into kind of the UFO or alien genre? And is that an intent of yours? And where do you think you're going to head with the show?
What's funny is I love getting into UFOs. I've been to ESETI several times. For the folks that listen to your show, they might know where that is. It's in Trout Lake, Washington. It's owned by James Gilliland, his ranch. There's something called the Field of Dreams there that sits on like sort of the edge of Mount Adams, where the most frequent anomalous light activity happens in the sky and on the mountains itself. That alone makes people question like what is going on here. So I've been there several times. I've had that experience. I've seen my own anomalous lights as well outside of that ranch. And the Cascade Mountains seem like such a prevailing character in our conversation today. But I think it's it's no stranger to being an attractor, a sort of a strange attractor to some of these experiences and events. So I've seen UFOs, driving through Snohomish, right? So, what's interesting, though, is I have not brought that to the show. And the reason I haven't brought it to the show is because I haven't found the right guest for it, honestly. The thing with Euphomet is that since it's an audio documentary, there's two parts to that. One is that we go and collect action tape. We go and do some sort of adventure, some sort of experience that I can then include within the show and bring folks into that situation a little bit more, sort of experientially. And the second fold is that I need to find a story that is sort of life-changing. And I need to find stories typically that have some sort of extra human resonance to them that's outside of just a sighting. And the sort of sad thing about, UFOs and the topic of extraterrestrials and so forth is that so often it's just I saw this incredible light formation and that's it, or I saw this. It's very rare that one light interaction leads to some other big thing in the life or some other change or some sort of momentous landmark moment that folks can connect to sort of emotionally and describe and give a broad reaction to. And, the caveat to that is those that have experienced some sort of interaction with extraterrestrials. And once we start getting into that neighborhood, it's very tricky. And I find it very tricky as a storyteller to approach some of those topics, because once we get into things like channeling Palladians and writing aboard crafts and abductions, speaking in light languages, finding a star family. Once you start getting into that space, it gets very, very otherworldly. And it's not necessarily grounded because it's so, for lack of better terms, it's so out there. So my challenge as a storyteller is to always present stories that people can sort of connect with emotionally, and that I don't think I'm, taking too big a peek behind the curtain for your listeners or mine in describing this show as a creative expression. And with that, trying to find the most earnest and honest stories possible to try to rip this stuff from a truth that is occurring in someone's lives. And not to say that the experiences that those that are affected or are initiated with things like having a child with a Palladian, but I think they're so strange per what our, sort of popular belief is, that it would be a creative challenge to try to ground it.
So, Jim, can you share a little bit with our listeners how they pick up Euphomet? It's some great short stories and great paranormal type experiences, and I think our listeners would really enjoy that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so Euphomet can be found most simply at euphomet.com. Euphomet is spelled EUPHOMET. That's kind of the double-edged sword of creating a word for your name. Is that it's not always the most easiest thing to spell for the unacquainted. On social, I typically suggest people follow me at It's Jim Perry on Twitter and Instagram. Those are the most sort of kept up social accounts for the show. Those will be the accounts that I update while I'm traveling to share essentially what adventures I'm on with and to comment on whatever is happening. And on Facebook, we have a group like most podcasts. It's called the Society of Euphomet. It's a closed group, but just ask for, ask to join, and we'll get you in there. And that's where folks go to chat about the show. That's where essentially I'll drop information about the show sometimes early. And those are the best places to listen and to get a hold of me.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks again for coming on Sasquatch Syndicate. We really appreciate it. I know our listeners do as well. As a reminder, if you'd like to be a guest on the show, you can reach us at sasquatchsyndicate.com and click contact. Again, tonight's guest was Jim Perry, host of Euphomet And Jim, we really, really appreciated the time and all of your insight here in the Pacific Northwest, the phenomenon of Sasquatch, and of course, the paranormal. So thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, you guys. I would really love the opportunity to meet with you guys in person since we all live in the same neck of the woods, and maybe we can go get in some trouble in the woods somewhere.
That sounds great.
Thank you guys. Later.
Take care, Jim.
All right, cheers.
This concludes our November 2018 podcast. Sasquatch Syndicate will return on Saturday, December 1st. Thanks to all of our listeners and those that have been out to our website and those following us on social media. Sasquatch is a controversial subject, so for all the believers and disbelievers and those that will tell you they have all the answers, just remember, we're flying through space at 700 miles per hour. Buckle up.